There are files sitting inside a palace investigation right now that have done something nobody in that building has managed to do in 30 years. They have left Charles completely unable to defend the woman he spent his entire life fighting for. Not because he does not want to, because he read what was in them. And what he read was not a mistake or a misunderstanding or a gap in communication. It was a plan. Detailed, patient, years in the making, built in the spaces nobody was supposed to look, and designed to secure Camilla's position inside this institution, not just for the rest of Charles's life, but for the decades that come after it, in a kingdom that will be ruled by a man she has spent 25 years being afraid of. I am Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the records, the inquiry documents, the reporting that got buried before anybody finished asking questions. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them, not a palace press release. To understand what these files actually represent, you have to understand the position Camilla was sitting in before a single page of them was ever written. She came into this family as the most resented woman in Britain. That is not an opinion. That is the documented public record. When Charles and Camilla married in April 2005, the country had spent 8 years watching Diana's funeral footage and reading everything that came out of the inquiry that followed. The public knew the shape of the affair. They knew about the Panorama interview. They knew what Diana had said about there being 3 people in that marriage, and they knew exactly who the third one was. Camilla understood all of this. She is not a stupid woman, and she has never been a naive one. She knew that walking into that Windsor ceremony was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the longest rehabilitation project the British monarchy had attempted since the abdication crisis of 1936. And she said about it with a patience and a discipline that most people who have never been inside that world do not fully appreciate. It worked. That is the thing you have to credit before you go any further into this story. It worked. By the time Charles was crowned in May 2023, the woman standing beside him was not the figure the public had despised for a decade. She was a queen consort the country had more or less arrived at accepting. That took 20 years of careful positioning, of charity work, of showing up and saying the right thing, and staying quiet when staying quiet was what the moment required. But here is what that rehabilitation required of her. And here is why it matters to everything that follows. Every single piece of it was built on Charles, his title, his protection, his willingness to use the authority of his position to stand between her and the institution's appetite for removing the people it finds inconvenient. She had no independent foundation inside that family, none. She had Charles and the shelter he provided, and the assumption that he would always be there to provide it. And in the last 2 years, that assumption started to crack. Charles was diagnosed with cancer in February 2024. He has not discussed the specifics beyond that initial statement, and he has continued working at a pace that commands genuine respect. But the people inside that building understand what a serious illness does to the internal balance of power in an institution that runs on personal authority. It shifts things, quietly, without announcements. It shifts things in the direction of the person who is well enough to be in the room every day. And that person is William. Camilla watched that shift happening. She had been watching it for years before the diagnosis. She understood before most people inside the palace had fully accepted it that the center of gravity in that building was moving toward her stepson, toward the man who had never once let her see what he was thinking, toward the man she had been physically frightened of since he was 16 years old. And so, she started planning. The files were not discovered through any dramatic act of investigation. That is the first thing you need to understand about how this came apart. Nobody broke into an office. Nobody intercepted a message. The discovery happened because of a routine legal review, the kind of administrative process that runs in the background of any large institutional estate and that generates paperwork nobody ever intends to read carefully. The review was triggered by a standard audit of patronage arrangements connected to the Duchy of Lancaster. If that name is unfamiliar, the Duchy of Lancaster is the sovereign's private estate. It generates income for the monarch personally, and it has administrative links to a range of royal charitable structures. Reviewing those links against current household arrangements is not unusual. Somebody does it every few years. What was unusual was what the reviewing officer found sitting inside a set of files that had been created under Camilla's household designation and cross-referenced against succession planning documents that had no business being connected to a patronage review at all. The officer flagged it. That flag went to a senior palace administrator. The administrator read what was in the folder and made a phone call that, by every account I have been able to piece together, visibly shook the person on the other end of it. That person was in William's office. And this is the detail that tells you everything about where power actually sits in that building right now. The call did not go to the king's private secretary first. It went to Kensington Palace. Whether that was a deliberate choice or a reflection of where the officer believed the real authority now operated, the effect was the same. William had the information before Charles did. He sat with it for 2 days, 2 full days in which he read every page of what had been found, had his own legal team review the documents, and built a precise understanding of what he was looking at before he decided what to do with it. Then he walked into a meeting with his father, and he put a folder on the table. But before we get to that meeting, you need to understand what was actually in the files, because the summary that has moved around the palace in the weeks since is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough. And the distance between the summary and the full picture is the distance between a woman making cautious preparations and a woman running a decades-long operation inside her own husband's household. The files contain 4 distinct categories of material, and each one, taken alone, could be explained away. Lined up together, they cannot. The first category was legal, specifically documents relating to the establishment of a private charitable foundation under Camilla's name, structured in a way that would give it independent operational status, regardless of changes to the wider royal household. In plain terms, a foundation that would keep running and keep generating institutional standing for Camilla, even after the conditions that currently support her royal position changed significantly. The legal structure had been drawn up by a firm with long connections to royal household advisors. It had been in preparation for at least 3 years. Now, a foundation is not inherently suspicious. Senior royals establish charitable foundations. That is a normal part of how this institution works. What is not normal is the specific legal architecture around this one. It had been built to be structurally independent of the crown in a way that most royal foundations are not. Most of them derive their institutional weight from their connection to the royal family. This one had been deliberately constructed so that its standing would survive the severing of that connection. Somebody had thought very carefully about what happens to Camilla's public position in a world where William is king and is not inclined to support it. The second category was patronage, a list of specific charitable patronages, some currently held by other members of the royal family, with attached notes on how each one might be transitioned to Camilla's foundation in the event of a household restructure. Some of those patronages had originally belonged to Diana. Stop and sit with that for a second, because it is not a small detail. Diana built her patronages out of genuine personal commitment: hospices, AIDS wards, landmine clearance. She gave those organizations something that could not be manufactured or borrowed, which was her own emotional presence and the public's love for her. Some of those same organizations had been in the process of being quietly revived under Catherine's office in recent months, as I covered previously. Finding them listed in Camilla's succession planning files, annotated with transition strategies, is the kind of detail that lands differently depending on which woman's name you read them under. The third category was residential. Notes on the legal status of Clarence House and the conditions under which it would remain available to Camilla after Charles's death. This category is the most straightforward of the 4. Every member of the royal family thinks about residential arrangements. It is not unusual to have legal advice on the subject. What drew the reviewing officer's attention was the level of detail in these documents and the clear assumption running through them that Clarence House would remain Camilla's primary residence on terms that did not require William's agreement. That assumption is legally complicated. The disposition of royal residences after a sovereign's death involves the incoming monarch in ways that these documents appeared to have been drafted to sidestep. The people who wrote them had been looking for a route around William's authority over the question, and they believed they had found one. They had not. William's legal team confirmed that within 48 hours. The fourth category was the one that changed the temperature in the room, where Charles eventually read it. Personal correspondence. Not a large volume of it, but specific enough and recent enough that it could not be attributed to old planning or historical caution. Letters between Camilla's most senior advisor and 2 individuals outside the royal household. One, a former government minister with ongoing connections to the House of Lords. One, a media figure with long relationships inside the palace press operation. The letters discussed the management of Camilla's public image in what they called the transition period. They discussed strategies for maintaining her visibility and relevance in a household where, as one letter put it with a directness that reads as either honest or reckless depending on your position, her principal source of support would no longer be available to her. Her principal source of support. That is how Camilla's most senior advisor described the reigning king in a private letter about what happens after he dies. Charles read that phrase and he put the document down on the desk, and he did not pick it up again for a very long time. The people who have described Charles in the days since he read those files keep coming back to the same word: frozen. Not angry in the way people expect from a man who has spent his life inside an institution that runs on controlled fury. Not loud, not demanding, frozen. And I want to be precise about what that word actually means in this context, because it is not a word people reach for when they are describing grief or betrayal in the ordinary sense. It is the word you use when a person has been handed information that has simultaneously destroyed a story they were telling themselves and removed every comfortable response available to them. Charles has spent 30 years telling himself a story about Camilla, and the story, at its core, is a love story. Whatever the public thought of it, whatever it cost Diana, whatever it cost his sons, whatever it cost his relationship with the country, during the years when her name was something people said with contempt. He held on to the story because it was the only way to make the whole thing bearable. He loved her, he chose her, and every sacrifice had been in service of something real. The files did not disprove the love story. I want to be careful here because that is not what I am telling you. What they proved was that while Charles was living inside the love story, Camilla was also running a separate operation. One that required her to think clearly and practically about a world in which he was gone. One that required her to make arrangements, cultivate allies, and prepare legal structures, all of it in the spaces of their shared life without telling him. Whether she told herself it was practical, whether she told herself it was responsible forward planning for a woman whose entire security inside an institution depended on one man's health. Whether she told herself he would understand if he knew, and that she was simply sparing him a difficult conversation. None of that changes what it looked like on paper. And Charles, who has read enough legal documents in his life to understand exactly what he is looking at, read it clearly. He sat in his study for a long time after the folder was closed. His private secretary was outside the door. Nobody went in. The staff gave him the space that experienced palace staff learned to give a man who needs to be alone with something, which is to say, they disappeared so completely, it was as though the corridor had never had people in it. When he finally came out, he told his private secretary to arrange a meeting with William, not that day, the following morning, and then he went back inside. That evening, he did not join Camilla for dinner. The official reason given to household staff was that he was managing fatigue related to his treatment. The people who were in the building that night have said something different. They said he simply could not sit across that table from her yet, that he needed one more night before he had to look at her face while carrying what he now knew. That is not the reaction of a man who has been handed a bureaucratic irregularity. That is the reaction of a man who has just read something that has changed the way he sees his own marriage. Now, I want to take you back further, because the files that surfaced in this review did not come out of nowhere, and Camilla did not build this operation alone. And to understand who helped her build it, you have to understand the household she has been assembling for the better part of a decade. Senior members of the royal family maintain their own households, their own private secretaries, their own communications teams, their own advisors who owe their positions specifically to the royal they serve. It is a system that creates intense personal loyalty because your entire career, your salary, your professional reputation, your access to one of the most unusual and powerful institutions in the world, all of it flows through one door. Camilla's household has been built quietly and methodically around people who understand that their futures are tied to hers. And in a world where William is Prince of Wales and then King, the person whose futures are most at risk are the people who bet everything on Camilla's continued relevance. So, the incentive to help her plan is not just professional loyalty, it is survival. The advisor whose letters appeared in the fourth category of those files has been with Camilla for 11 years. He came to her from a background in political communications, which means he understands something that palace lifers sometimes do not, which is that a public figure's power is not fixed. It can be built, it can be protected, and if you are clever enough about it, it can be made to persist even when the structural support underneath it has changed. He had been watching William's consolidation of power for years. He had watched Andrew gone, Harry gone, the extended family phased back, the court circle shrinking. He had understood before most people inside the building what the monarchy William intended to build looked like. And he had understood that there was no obvious place in it for the woman whose continuation depended on a dying king's protection. So he started building one, the charitable foundation, the patronage strategy, the residential documents, the carefully worded letters to allies outside the household. None of it was improvised. All of it reflects someone who sat down with a clear understanding of the threat and worked systematically through every available tool. Whether Camilla directed all of it personally, or whether her advisor was working ahead of her explicit instructions, is a question that matters enormously and that nobody inside the palace has yet been able to answer definitively. It is the question Charles has been sitting with since he read the folder, because the answer changes everything. It is the difference between a wife who was planning behind her husband's back and a wife who had an advisor who ran ahead of what she knew and placed her in an impossible position. Both of those things are bad. They are bad in completely different ways, and Charles cannot yet establish which one is true. The meeting between William and his father happened at Kensington Palace. That detail is worth holding on to. When the Prince of Wales requests that a conversation happen at his own residence rather than at Buckingham Palace, it is not a logistical preference. In that world, where a meeting is held tells you as much as what is said inside it. Charles came to his son's house. The folder was already on the table. William had learned to run these meetings. He does not walk people through documents dramatically. He does not narrate. He puts the material in front of the relevant person and lets them read. And while they read, he watches. He had seen this before. The yacht files, the charity donation cross-references, the meeting nobody logged. He had sat across from palace officials who could not give him clean answers, and he had let the silence do the work. This was different because the person reading was his father, and because what his father was reading was not a governance failure. It was a portrait of his wife. William did not speak for a long time after Charles finished, and Charles did not speak either. That is the detail that stays with me about every account of that morning. Two men in a room with an open folder between them, and neither of them saying a word. When William finally spoke, he did not make accusations. He asked 3 questions, each one quiet, each one precise. He asked whether Charles had known about the foundation structure. He asked whether Charles had seen the patronage transition documents. He asked whether Charles had any knowledge of the correspondence with the external advisors. The answer to all 3 was the same. Charles had not known. He had not seen. He had no knowledge. And that answer, delivered by a king sitting in his heir's house on a gray morning in London, is the thing that breaks the story open. Because if Charles did not know, then the planning was not cautious pragmatism that he had simply not been consulted on. It was a parallel operation running inside his own household, built around the assumption of his death, using access that his position had provided, directed at least in part toward protecting Camilla from the authority of the son he loves. William looked at his father, and then he said something that has been repeated by people who were near that room afterwards. He said he was not telling him because he wanted action. He was telling him because he deserved to know what had been built inside his own house. That sentence is the most devastating thing in this entire story, not because of what it demands, because of what it does not demand. William did not ask Charles to choose. He did not issue an ultimatum. He did not put a set of required responses on the table with a deadline attached. He handed his father the truth, and he stepped back from it. And that restraint is more powerful than any ultimatum he could have issued, because it leaves Charles nowhere to go, except toward his own conscience. The conversation between Charles and Camilla that followed is the one nobody in that building wants to describe in any detail. And I want to be honest with you about the limits of what I can tell you here, because what happened in that room belongs to 2 people, and neither of them has let it out cleanly. What I can tell you is what the people around them observed in the days after it. Charles did not look the way he looks when he is managing an institutional difficulty. He looked the way he looks when something personal has gone through him. The staff who have been with him long enough to know the difference say they have not seen him carry something this quietly since the weeks after Diana died. And in both cases, the silence has the same quality. It is not the silence of a man who has nothing to say. It is the silence of a man who has too much to say and no safe place to put any of it. Camilla's response, from everything that has filtered out of the household since, moved through several phases. The first was explanation. She had not directed the foundation planning herself, she said. Her advisor had been working ahead of her explicit instructions. The documents did not represent a decision she had made, but a preparation her team had undertaken without her full knowledge. There is a version of that explanation that is true. And Charles knows enough about how royal households operate to understand that a senior advisor with a long career and a clear view of the institutional landscape does not always wait for explicit instructions before he starts building a structure he believes his principal is going to need. But there is another version, and the correspondence with the external media figure is the problem with the simple version. Because those letters are specific in a way that staff do not usually get to be without the person they serve knowing the direction of travel. They discuss Camilla's positioning, her visibility, her relevance in a post-Charles household. They discuss it in her name and on her behalf, and they do it with the confidence of someone who has talked to her about it. Charles read those letters twice. He has not said publicly or privately, from what I can establish, which version he believes. And that silence is the marriage in microcosm right now. Two people in the same residence carrying the same unanswered question, and neither of them yet ready to say it out loud. What Camilla could not explain away, and did not try to explain away, was the patronage list, the one that included organizations Diana had built. Whatever the intention behind including them, however, the advisor had framed it in whatever conversation he did or did not have with her. The list exists. The annotations exist. And Charles sitting across from his wife with that list in his mind is not a simple conversation to have. Because Diana is always in the room in that family. She has never left it. Her sons carry her. Her portrait now hangs in the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor. Her patronages are being reactivated under Catherine's name. And the woman who spent 25 years removing her traces from that building has just been found by her own husband to have had those same organizations listed in a document about her own future. That is not a governance question. That is something much older and much heavier than governance. Princess Anne found out about the files from William directly. That was not an accident. He called her the same day he met with Charles, and he told her the outline, not the detail, the shape. Anne did not say much. That is consistent with everything you need to know about how she processes information she has been waiting years to receive. She asked one question. She asked whether Charles was all right. William said he was managing it. Anne said that managing it and being all right are not the same thing, and that somebody should make sure the distinction does not get lost in the handling of all the institutional parts of this. Then she said one more thing. She said she was not surprised, and the way she said it, according to William, was not the tone of someone who has been expecting bad news. It was the tone of someone who has been watching a pattern for a very long time and has just been shown the document that confirms what the pattern always indicated. Anne has never trusted Camilla. That runs 50 years deep. I have covered the full history of it before. The relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles, the wedding Anne sat through in 1973, the 5 decades of cold civility that have never resolved into anything warmer. She has watched Camilla move through this family, and she has made her own read on the woman's character across all of that time. She did not say, "I told you so." That is not how Anne operates. She does not give you the satisfaction of seeing that she was right. She simply notes the information and files it in the same permanent and unforgiving way she files everything. What she said to one person privately in the days after is the thing that has moved quietly through the household ever since. She said that a woman who plans for a man's death as though his death is an opportunity has already told you everything you need to know about how she understood the marriage. She said it once. She did not repeat it. She did not need to. 5 words from Anne at a gallery, and the country talked about it for weeks. She has learned that precision is more devastating than volume, and the sentence she said privately about Camilla and the files is going to follow that woman through every corridor of that building for as long as both of them are inside it. Here is where things stand inside that palace right now, and I want to be honest with you about what has changed and what has not. The foundation has been suspended, not formally dissolved, suspended. The legal architecture that Camilla's advisor built is sitting in a kind of administrative limbo while the palace's own legal team goes through every element of it. That process will take months, and its outcome will be decided by people who ultimately answer to William, The advisor himself has not been removed from his position. That detail surprises people when they hear it, and I think it is worth sitting with, because it tells you something about where Charles is right now. He has not moved against the man who built the structure. He has not demanded his resignation. And the reason, from what I understand, is that removing him would constitute a formal acknowledgement that what was found is as serious as it is. It would make the whole thing a matter of institutional record in a way that Charles is not yet ready for it to become. He is still protecting her. Even now, that is the man. But the protection has a different quality to it than it had before. Before the files, Charles's defense of Camilla was the instinctive, total, unconditional defense of a man who has chosen someone and will not revisit the choice regardless of the cost. After the files, the defense is still there, but it is coming from a different place. It is deliberate now in a way it never had to be before. It requires effort. It requires him to actively decide each morning to maintain the posture rather than simply inhabiting it. That is an enormous thing to change inside a marriage. And the people around them can see the change even if neither of them would ever describe it in those terms. Camilla's schedule has continued to contract. The pattern I described when covering the yacht scandal has not reversed. Engagements are fewer, staff numbers are smaller. The briefing documents that reach her have continued to narrow. None of that has changed because of the files. The files are a separate layer sitting on top of a structural shift that was already well underway. What the files have changed is the one thing that was still working for her. They have changed Charles. And without Charles, the entire position she built over 30 years has no foundation under it. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London. He has spent the 28 years since then becoming the man who could walk back into that institution and begin the work of correcting what it did to her. He has done that work without anger in public, without a single unnecessary word, with a patience that people who underestimate him have consistently mistaken for passivity. The files are not his doing. He did not plant them. He did not manufacture the review that found them. He simply made sure, when they surfaced, that they reached the people they needed to reach and that they were understood clearly. That is the William who has been sitting quietly and receiving lines for a decade while the ground underneath the institution shifted toward him. Camilla spent 25 years believing she had won. She had the ring, she had the crown, she had the walls of that palace arranged around her, and she had built, in the spaces nobody was watching, what she believed was a structure that would protect her even after the one person defending her was gone. She had not considered that the one person most likely to find that structure was the one person she had never been able to manage, the one person who had never once let her see what he was thinking, the boy who walked silently behind his mother's coffin and made himself a promise that day that he has never broken and has never once mentioned to her face. Charles is sitting tonight in the same building as the woman he has loved for 50 years. The folder is closed. The files are in an evidence room somewhere in the palace administrative system. Outside the windows, the institution continues exactly as it always has. The cars and the engagements and the statements and the carefully arranged appearances of a family that does not do its most important business in public. Inside, a man who has spent his whole life choosing this woman is sitting with the knowledge that she was planning for a world without him, and that the planning was detailed enough and careful enough and far enough advanced that someone had to flag it as a problem before he ever knew it existed. Diana wrote a letter to her solicitor in October of 1995. She wrote that she was afraid of what was being planned around her without her knowledge. She wrote about feeling unprotected inside an institution that was supposed to be her family. She was right to be afraid, and nobody with the authority to act on what she wrote did anything with it for 6 years. Her son is now the one with the authority. And when a document surfaced that told him something important about what was being planned inside his family without his knowledge, he read it on the same day it arrived. He understood it immediately, and he walked it into a room where it could not be ignored. Diana would recognize that. She would recognize the boy she raised in the man who did it, the one she sat down with and told the truth to when the truth was the hardest possible thing to hear. She gave him that. The belief that knowing the truth is always better than being protected from it. He has never forgotten it. He is not capable of forgetting it. And Camilla, walking past Diana's portrait in the Hall of Matriarchs every morning on her way through Windsor, living inside a marriage that will never quite be what it was, Carrying the knowledge that the files exist and that William has read them, and that the institution is now run by the one person she was building all of it to survive, has to understand what that means. She planned for a world without Charles. She did not plan for a world where Diana's son had already seen the plan. That is where this ends. Not with a scene, not with a confrontation or a statement or a press release. With a document in an evidence room, and a man who read it before his father did, and a king who is sitting tonight with the weight of knowing what was built inside his own house. The silence after that is not empty. It never is in that family. It is full of everything nobody is saying yet. And in that family, what nobody is saying yet has a way of becoming the next thing that changes everything.